I will also begin by sharing my slides. I think I'm working between two screens, so hopefully this is the correct screen.
That's fine,
sorry, I just
Catriona.
want
We can see that.
Can you see my notes or can you see the full slide?
It's not on presenter mode, so you might want to just
Okay.
start slideshow.
That's fine. I can't actually see you all. But that's okay. I'll begin. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thanks, Ros, for the introduction. Today is, I suppose, just reporting back from a project I've been working on, but I also thought it might be a nice opportunity for us to have a conversation about ethics at the University of the Highlands and Islands and some of the work that we do and some ways that we might consider doing kind of community-based research in the future in light of some of the findings from this project. So I'll also just to note that I've included some images in the slides. Most are my own, but I state whether or not mine. And some of them just kind of give a flavour of the places that we know and we all work in across rural and island Scotland. So this presentation, I'm going to give you a short history of community land ownership. I don't count myself kind of a specialist on this, and then there are others on the call who are very much know a lot more than I do, but I thought a bit of context was interesting and helpful for those who don't know all that much about it. I then want to talk about some of the challenges that have arisen with this increase in research interest in community land ownership and some solutions, one of which is CLAN, the Community Landownership Academic Network. And I know Bobby's on this call and Bobby's been instrumental in developing that network. And CLAN has also been very supportive of this work itself. Then I'm just going to talk to you about the project I've been doing, my approach to it, some of the findings from the research and some recommendations and further reflections. And then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. Unfortunately, I cannot see you all. So if you do have kind of any, we'll save questions for the end, but if there's anything immediate that comes up, please just unmute yourself because I can't see any hands, which feels weird talking into the abyss, but I think it'll be okay. So a short history of community land ownership. This will not be news for many of you, but as you all may appreciate, Scotland has one of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership in the world, with 421 landowners owning 50% of the private rural land. And of course, this is in part a legacy from the country's history, its contribution and exposure to processes of colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, globalisation, and the Highland clearances. And land reform is an effort to address past injustices and improve Scotland's system of land ownership and its use. And the beginning of reforming the land in Scotland is really contested. Michael Russer, who's currently the chair of the Scottish Land Commission, recently stated in just last month that this has been a journey for arguably the past 100 years, since Lord Leverhulme transferred the Stornoway estate in 1923 to a charitable trust comprised of local people. But since the inception of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, land reform has really been a central point of discussions by politicians, activists and communities, and there's been various legislation that's gone through, along with other funding mechanisms and policy interventions, which has sought to undo the system of kind of concentrated land ownership and seek to change the use, the rights and responsibilities in the spirit of land to ensure kind of it contributes to a fair and just society. So community ownership is but one form of land reform, and on a global scale, it's not necessarily a new concept. It resonates with Indigenous stewardship and post-colonial reforms, and in Scotland, there's examples of governing for the common good already. There are shieldings, there are municipal boroughs, crofting and the common grazing systems, for example. But in its current form, community ownership is a relatively new concept, and this is an approach to land reform which involves the transfer of ownership of a landholding to those who live on or close to it, often to constituted bodies who can act on behalf of their members in the community. And many of you will know there's been numerous community buyouts over the last few decades. Knoydart, which is where this photo was taken last summer, Egg, Gia, the Western Isles, the borders, in cities and towns, many supporters herald community land ownership as a well-established model for local development and resilience. Communities are managing lands, building houses, restoring forests and peatlands, managing pubs, developing new enterprises, and encouraging local revitalisation. And importantly, with the increase of community land ownership, there's obviously been an increase in the requests asked of them, not only to manage the land and its assets and support local opportunities, but to share their stories. This has been in various forms, including news, articles, and films, but this project specifically considers this in light of research requests for community landowners to take part in research projects. And in some ways, this kind of attention on community land ownership isn't really surprising because it kind of combines narratives of revolution, restitution, empowerment, the common, sustainable development. And a lot of the activities are kind of taking part in across Scotland in rural and island places that are often seen as quite dramatic and interesting. However, the number of requests and the nature of some of them can pose problems. And anecdotally, there have been reports of unmanageable numbers of requests for organisations, many of which these organisations are sustained by volunteers, and people were just feeling they couldn't really contribute and there were kind of problematic issues arising. And so many of you will know that Clan was kind of set up in response to this. And Bobby, I'm aware I'm talking about the project that you really started, so correct me if I make any errors. But this was set up in 2021 to strategically coordinate research to both support communities and build a compendium of relevant knowledge regarding community land ownership. And it aims to encourage and facilitate a strategic and sustainable approach to community land ownership research, which benefits the researcher, the respondent community, and wider policy and practice stakeholders. And in 2023, Clan did, I'm afraid I've not finished my writing in that slide, but Clan did a lot of research into some of the kind of issues that community landowners were facing themselves and the ways in which they've interacted or not interacted with research. And there were various findings. The report is available if you want to have a read, but just some highlights. The research found that on no occasion had the community actually been asked to input into research design of projects. Some people felt that researchers were perceived as uninformed or didn't really know what they were looking into or didn't have the background of knowledge that perhaps they should have done. And there was a common feeling generally that research was not really of benefit to the community and could actually be harmful in some circumstances. And there were some kind of not very good practices highlighted. So this kind of wider context of land reform, community land ownership, research interest, and then Clan itself all kind of combined together to contribute to the setting up of this report that I've been working on, which was titled The Co-Production of Guidance to Inform an Ethical Research Protocol for Clan. So here's a wee bit about the project. It started technically in January, although actually kind of I was able to kind of really get started on it in February, March. And I'm in the process of just finalising the final report for it. It was funded by, and this is a mouthful, the Scottish Government Centre of Expertise, Knowledge Exchange and Innovation. And this is part of the Scottish Government's Environment, Natural Resources and Agricultural Research portfolio. They also go by SEFARI Gateway for simplicity. And essentially the kind of the aim of the project was to develop practical guidance, which can be used by researchers and those who supervise them, community organisations and other actors to promote and encourage improved, robust research practice in community land ownership. And just a little bit of background. So the starting point, and this was actually in the brief itself, the starting point of the fellowship, as the project was known as, was the assertion that the current ethical requirements of academic research should be viewed as the absolute minimum, and that research activity should seek to go well beyond these in order to not harm and indeed benefit individual and community respondents whilst retaining research integrity. Furthermore, they stated in the brief, community organisations should, in most cases, have the opportunity to be involved in the design and delivery of research and have a realistic expectation that findings are fed back in a timely and accessible fashion. So here's a wee bit of some of the methods that I used in pulling together this work. First one, not really a method per se, but just to let you know, I conducted quite a significant literature review on ethical research what counts as kind of ethical research with community organizations, different kinds of methodologies or methods that might be used to promote kind of more ethical best practice. And this, I very much looked at kind of academic theory on this, which I'll speak a little bit more about. But I also looked at a variety of sort of practical literature. Some people call it grey literature, but I kind of don't really like using that term. But what exists out there that communities have already put forward. And there's a kind of whole range of examples of this within Scotland, but also overseas. And I particularly was quite interested in where Indigenous communities have developed guides for best practice. So I kind of considered a lot of those and pulled them together in a literature review. I also conducted secondary data analysis on some of the work that Bobby had done in informing Clan. And so he had conducted interviews, so we ran surveys and a couple of workshops. So I reviewed some of that data and pulled out relevant information for developing a kind of ethical guidance. I conducted sort of primary data collection. This was a workshop which was organised in June 2024 at Perth College. Lots of smiley people. You'll see lots of hats. We were playing on the idea that we all wear different hats when we get involved in research or get involved in anything, really. So sometimes we come as a community member, sometimes we're a researcher, sometimes we might be a funder, sometimes we're a supervisor, and we're kind of playing with that idea. And then I also conducted another workshop with community landowners this year. That was at the Community Woodlands Association. So I got a lot of quite raw data from people speaking directly with me, and I analysed all of them and kind of moved them into the report, I suppose. So I just want to talk a wee bit about the literature review, because this was really interesting, and I'd be happy to kind of share this review with people if you're interested. So I think it's important to define what we're talking about when we are looking at this. So I tried to define what research is, what ethics is, and what community-based research might mean. There was a variety of definitions I've pulled together. One that I wanted to kind of highlight to you was a definition of ethics. And I'm just going to read this out. Hopefully it's of interest. So ethics is often defined as the principle of doing no harm. This is by Banks et al. 2013. But within scholarly discourse, it represents a complex system of moral principles that, in academic work, guides researchers in attempting to conduct their work responsibly. However, it cannot be reduced to procedural compliance, and that's what I found throughout a lot of the literature. And it requires continuous reflection, particularly in contexts where power imbalances are embedded, which they often are in research. So for community-based researchers, ethical engagement extends beyond formal approval processes to encompass relations, situated engagement, reflexivity, and respect for local knowledge and power dynamics. Ethics should therefore be understood not merely as a regulatory requirement, but as a foundation for rigorous, socially just, and reflexive research practice. I also was quite interested in the literature of this kind of concept of everyday ethics, which scholarship sees as an approach that foregrounds ethics as embedded in daily practice and interpersonal relationships, rather than as an abstract system of principles. And I find this all quite interesting because ethical questions are actually very salient in community-based research, which is often actually characterised by reciprocal relationships between researchers and communities. And so generally, there's just a growing recognition that ethics might be approached as an ongoing, negotiated process that recognises issues of representation, consent, power, and justice, and not simply codes of conduct or frameworks. And in this literature review, I was also interested in a lot of decolonial theory. There's Linda Smith of 2012 has written a lot about this, as have many others. And decolonial and feminist perspectives encourage, generally, researchers to consider their own positionality and how their acts of studying and representing people may perpetuate domination. This includes recognising that all knowledge is partial and situated, that researchers should assume responsibility for the perspectives they articulate and deeply consider the power dynamics embedded within their work. And I was also quite interested in, this kind of feminist care ethics too, which offers perspectives by basically saying that researchers have moral responsibilities in their work. And there's two feminist scholars, Fisher and Toronto, who differentiate between caring about, so recognizing the needs of others, in light of caring for, so taking active responsibility for addressing those needs. And they encourage researchers to act ethically, not only by following formal guidelines, and this is quite a common theme, but actually by developing themselves empathy, attentiveness, and accountability within their research relationships. So that's quite a lot of information, but I just thought it was quite interesting. And I suppose some findings from this work have just been come quite clearly through the literature. And I also just, that last bullet point, wanted to note that in addition to kind of academic theory on this, there's also a range of practical guides that are incredible and really helpful that I've reviewed some of. And I'm very aware of the Island Research Network, which is fantastic, and they've produced a really helpful guide for people who are working on islands. There's the Agroecological Research Collaboration, who have produced guidelines. There's so many protocols in North America, for example. Durham has done a lot of work on this, and so has Science Ceilidh, an organisation I've worked a wee bit with. So basically, I'm pleased that there's a lot of work and desire to kind of continue to further ethical research practice. And I suppose this was all about kind of pulling things together that would inform how CLAN might approach this. So just some actual findings from some of the research, both kind of in reviewing the literature, but also in some of the kind of secondary and primary data from analysing all of those. And these are just sort of key findings. There's many more, and I'd be happy to talk to people directly, or I can send you the final report when it's all finished. Some of these are quite obvious. You know, in ethical research, we can actually never fully minimize harm. And I think this is actually a really important thing to say, and is essentially a finding from this research. But we can and we must promote better practice. And I was really interested in just how much work this actually requires on an ongoing basis. And ethics always requires constant negotiation between a range of publics and a range of people. I was really struck by this desire for co-designing research with and for communities, and that research kind of, in order to be as ethical as possible, is really kind of in relation with people and with place and with desires on the ground, with desires for researcher, and having kind of shared communication. Some key principles that came up throughout the literature, but also with those I spoke with, was this importance of positionality and recognizing who you might be as a researcher and how that might therefore impact the work you do or the ways in which you approach your work. And actually just recognizing that. It's very kind of relevant in the social sciences. And I studied anthropology as my background, and that was often kind of held up. You know, you'd have whole screeds of who you were as an anthropologist before you actually then got into looking at what you wanted to look at. Transparency and trust were key principles that came up all the time and were really just fundamental to ethical work. Upholding, ensuring that there is consent for the work, and also where you've said that there should be confidentiality, ensuring that this is adhered to. Respect, reciprocity, and responsibility of everyone involved in a research relationship was really key. The importance of communication, I'll talk a wee bit more about that, but that really was fundamental. And just this concept of time. A lot of these things take time, and that can't be understated. Another key finding was actually that guides and protocols, although ethics is not simply kind of codes of conduct and frameworks, it can be helped by guides and protocols, and there are many that exist. And I've tried to kind of provide some examples of what might exist for, what might help CLAN's approach, and what might be a CLAN protocol. And also another finding was that effort is required across or from different people in a research relationship. And this is particularly important to those who have arguably more influence or power to change processes within that research relationship. Funders, for example, it was highlighted, have quite a lot of power in funding projects, but also on the timelines, and whether they could build in more time for people to kind of build good relationships with communities, for example, that would be helpful. And principal investigators also have quite a lot of influence and power and can seek to kind of promote better ethical practice in various ways. This is something I kind of wanted to highlight in particular from the work I've done. And forgive me, I'm just going to read out something from the report, but I hope it's of interest. So pre, during, and post. This is kind of pre-research, during research, and post-research. Those timings were highlighted by quite a number of people, and people kind of stated that there's a different set of things that are needed pre-research taking place, when research is actually taking place, and then after the fact. And I think, although we shouldn't kind of use silos in that way, they are actually helpful distinctions. And yeah, I'll just explain a wee bit more. So in the pre-research phase, for example, several community landowners and membership organisations recommended that researchers reflect on their role in research and how their choices might impact the outcomes of the project. So that very much links to that positionality piece I spoke about. Community landowners also strongly emphasise the importance of the pre-research stage to establish the real needs of community organisations, arguing that researchers should spend time understanding work that might have already taken place. Community members recommended that researchers also spend time asking fundamental questions, such as what research has taken place, is this project relevant for the context or the time frame? Do I, as a researcher, have the necessary skills to support and properly conduct this work? And what might be the benefit of this to the wider community? So asking those questions up front before engaging in kind of a research relationship. Sam also mentioned, of course, that before a research project begins, researchers and communities might want to consider having a code of conduct in place or perhaps a memorandum of understanding. But a lot of people also recognise that this should be proportional to the size of the research project. If it's a very small project, then that might not be necessary. But if it's kind of a multi-year thing, then perhaps a memorandum of understanding is important. Also during this pre-research phase, people spoke a lot about the use of language. I heard from one person that they said as soon as an email lands in their inbox that says, "Dear Sir, Madame," and has a research request in it, they have an informal policy within this community landowner that they just get rid of that email. They don't respond. So actually the use of language is really important. And also an upfront recognition of research incentives and payments was highlighted by many as to be quite an important aspect of working together. During the research phase, there were recommendations made about when research should take place. I'm sure many of you appreciate on this call, there's times in the year where people are busier, and actually researchers need to be really aware of that. You might not go to the Western Isles in April, May, perhaps, especially if you're wanting to speak to crofters. Also just recognising that a lot of people volunteer time, and so they might not have the means to contribute during the week, but could do so at the weekend. And then finally, post-research. So respondents generally were quite wary that researchers often don't feed back to those who've contributed to their work. And a lot of the feeding back is often text-based, and this is something I kind of want to look more into. There's also in some sort of literature, there's concepts of beyond text outputs. So not just having a written report, but actually is there a workshop you could hold to report back? Or is there a poem? I know, Leonie, you're on the call. Or what other kind of text-based, more than text-based approaches could we use? And then there was other calls, considering co-publishing with community members, and also encouraging using membership organisations to disseminate some of the work that you might want to the world. So some wider reflections. These are all quite obvious and perhaps just repetition, but I do think throughout doing this whole project, I've realised that whilst it's quite complicated to think of ethics, and whilst we all have busy lives and research is hard, being a community landowner is hard, I think it's really important that we do pay attention to this and we do try and do better. And there's a lot of resources out there already that can help us kind of inform how we might do that. I think it's also just a wider reflection. It's really important, and I try to think of this in my own work, that actually think it's a fallacy that researchers have an inherent right to knowledge about things. And actually, sometimes it is for a community landowner to say, no, we don't want to engage in that project. And that's also okay. We kind of have to honor that. Wider reflection, this is difficult. And all of these things take time, and they take resources, and they take training, and they take difficult conversations. But we kind of do owe it to our communities and to ourselves to try and do better. And I just like this photo, and I just think that this is an example of, I suppose I included this just to show there's a wealth of knowledge out there within communities. And I do think unless we kind of do better, we run the risk of not actually maybe being able to hear from them in ways that feel generous and regenerative and so on. So, and then this is now the question, maybe I'll rephrase the question actually. It's not where do we begin, but where do we go from here? Because we're not starting afresh with thinking about ethics, because I'm sure many of you on the call already do, and we already have to go through ethics processes at the UHI. But I suppose I'm wondering where do we go now with these findings from this research and with a potential protocol? How do we kind of continue to ensure that ethics remains considered, not just at the start of a research project, but all the way through? So that's something I'm mulling on and would love feedback on, or would love just to have a conversation with people about. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I have no idea how long I've been talking for, because I can't see you, and I'm very excited to stop sharing my screen so I can actually see people. But yeah, thank you. I'm just writing up the report, and I'd be happy to share it with people. I also just want to say a huge thanks to so many people who've been involved, especially to Bobby, because it's kind of been a bit of a collaboration with him and with Clan, and to many of the community landowners who have inputted into the work. And yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Catriona. That was fascinating, very thought-provoking. Lots of really interesting reflections there. I can see lots of virtual applause going on there. So thanks everybody for attending as well. But we can take some questions. You were bang on half an hour, Catriona, so it's very well timed. But I might, if it's okay, I might kick off